Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of What We Really Want. Just wanted to remind you that we have a new website address for the show. It's whatwereallywant.show. Now, in today's episode, just want to let you know you're going to hear a lot of initials with our talk with Carol, the coach, Carol Sheets. You're going to hear things like CSAT, like AVR, like AppSats and ERCEM, and just we don't want people to be confused or overwhelmed. Just know that in the show notes, we're going to have links and explanations of all the stuff that we're talking about. If you or someone that you know is navigating through the choppy waters of sex addiction and betrayal trauma recovery, this is going to be a really helpful interview with somebody who has been in this work for such a long time and has helped so many people. So it's going to be great. Here we go.
Welcome to What We Really Want, conversations about connection. Settle in and get ready for a great conversation. Let's talk about what we really want.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to What We Really Want. This is episode 23, and it's called The Gift of Empathy. Our guest is Carol Sheets, also known as Carol the Coach. And Stacy and I had a great conversation with Carol, and we can't wait for you to hear it. So before we get into the conversation with Carol, I want to do a little quiz with you.
Oh, dear.
There are a lot of initials that we hear Carol use in the conversation, and I'm going to quiz you on a few of them and just see if you know what they stand for.
Oh, no.
Okay. Start with one that I'm pretty sure you'll get. CSAT, C-S-A-T.
Oh,
Stands
I got
for
that one. Certified Sex Addiction Therapist.
Okay. What about, very good, by the way. What about AVR?
AVR. Acknowledge. Validate. Reassure.
You got it.
I don't have the book in front of me, so.
Yeah, so you're going to hear a lot of initials, and we didn't want you to be confused because some of them we actually flesh those out and say what they are, and some of them we don't. So just a little pop quiz, and
Thanks
you
for
did
that.
Fantastic.
Between you and Carol, you put me on the spot.
If I wasn't looking at it on my phone, I wouldn't have been able to say it either.
Okay, that makes me feel better.
One of the things, though, that we also talked about was the importance of empathy. I mean, this episode's called The Gift of Empathy, and how important it is for betraying partners to practice and experience and show empathy towards their spouse, their partner that they've hurt. And some stuff that first off, Carol released a book in 2019 called Help Her Heal, and it was an empathy workbook for partners of sex addicts to help their partners heal. And she does such a good job of explaining to men. This book is written to men. We know that it's not only men who betray their partners. Women do that too. But this book was primarily written for a male audience. She does a great job of helping men understand this is what your partner is going through. And sometimes I've talked to men who have been working on that workbook, and they really feel a lot of shame coming up because it's just bubbling up some of their own things. And it's hard for them to hang on to themselves and to be able to show empathy because they're battling shame in their own minds. And one of the things that Carol says is that early in the process, the betraying partner has to do the bulk of the work. And that always makes people say, hey, wait a minute, don't both partners have work to do? And they do. And we talk about how this is not forever. The empathy says that right now, while you are regulating from the shock and the trauma that this has caused, I've got to really show up and I've got to take some of the hits, really.
Right.
And I think it's important for people who have, even out of their own brokenness and even out of their own trauma, which needs to be understood, needs to be explored, have done these horrible things, we've got to recognize that empathy for our spouse means that we do take some of those early hits.
Right. Because I would imagine most couples who have this in their story had some dysfunction, unhealthy habits, separate from, the sexual betrayal, because we're human. And so when we first get into recovery, when this all comes out, I can imagine that it would be really hard for the betraying partner to take everything, like all the hits, basically, like you said, because there's
without getting defensive,
without being defensive,
shutting down.
Because even you never, ever, ever suggested one time that I had any responsibility in your choices. But I know there were things that ways we functioned and things that I would say that certainly didn't make you feel safe and protected. And, I'm not saying it gave you an excuse. You wouldn't say it either, but I just can understand that it would be really hard. There is more to work through, but we can't even see it in the early days. We just can't.
Right.
See straight.
And when do we move from what you just call the early days into latter phases where
Right.
now the partner who has done the betraying actually gets to speak up for themselves?
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really, really long introduction, but we thought it would be helpful to give you a little bit of kind of how we have learned the critical importance of practicing empathy, me towards you, but also you towards me, which is another thing that Carol talks about. Eventually, even the betrayed partner is able to heal to the point where she can see some of the wounding and the trauma that contributed to her partner's addiction.
Yeah.
That was the source of her pain, and
Yeah.
even show empathy towards what he went through. And again,
That's
this
right.
is not a phase one thing. This is
Yeah.
not an early days thing. But yeah, as we've learned how to show empathy and understanding towards each other, we just thought that might be helpful for some of you to hear who might be going through things like that right now. But it's a fantastic conversation with someone who really, anybody who has benefited from working with a sex addiction therapist or in this area over the past 20 or 30 years really owes something to Carol the coach, because she was truly one of the pioneers.
Yeah.
So Carol Sheets, author of Help Her Heal and Help Them Heal, which is an empathy workbook for both partners within the coupleship, was just a fantastic, just a delightful guest. And we know that you're going to love hearing from Carol. So here comes episode 23 with Carol Sheets, The Gift of Empathy. Carol Sheets, also known as Carol the Coach, we're so grateful that you're with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure. I remember talking to you way back when, about 10 years ago, and
That's right.
I know that you have a passion for this work, and that's what we all have, is a passion for the work. And so I'm glad to meet you too, Stacy. It's
Yes.
fun to work with couples.
It's good to meet you.
I'm really excited about talking with you about some of the things that you have released as resources and helps for couples walking through sexual betrayal recovery. Because the last time you and I talked, I don't think you had even started your YouTube channel yet. I don't think that, well, I know that Help Her Heal and Help Them Heal had not come out. And so there's an awful lot for us to talk about. But before we do, let me just ask you, Carol, what do you really want out of our conversation today?
I believe that it's important as professionals talk with a passion to kind of educate each other on what's new and coming and what our clients should look for, to always send the message that there is hope for couples. That's my big thing. There's hope for couples if empathy is employed. That's what I hope we can do today, is talk more about that.
Yeah, I love
That's
that.
right.
Well, Carol, I know a lot about what you do just because I've been following you a lot of the time that I've been in recovery myself, and as we've been helping other people, but I don't know an awful lot about you personally. And so before we jump into the stuff, we'd just love for you to tell us anything you want to, just about your background, about you personally. Help our listeners get to know Carol a little bit.
Okay. And I never have any problem talking about that. I started in the field of mental health 43 years ago. And 25 years ago, I looked at the psychiatrist that I worked with and I said, I want to reach people globally. And that was just in general. That wasn't the betrayal trauma community or the sex addiction community. And he said, how do you want to do that, Carol? And I said, well, I want to be positive and I want to help people actualize their goals. And he kind of looked at me and he said, how are you going to do that? And I said, well, write a book or start a radio show or be on television. And he said, well, what would you need to write the book? I think that would be the easiest. And I said, a sabbatical. And he goes, not going to happen, Carol. And I said, then I'll go for the other two. And what I did was I decided that I would do regular segments on the news and that I would also start a phone-in call show on the radio. And so I made a demo at a high school with a kid that I knew.
Oh, wow.
And I brought in two of my friends and I said, don't say anything about what you're going to ask me. Let's make this organic. And he flipped the switch that made it sound like they were calling in. And they both asked me questions and I answered and we made a demo. And I sent it out to all the radio stations and the television stations and heard nothing. And so I waited 6 months and I sent it out again. And then I sent it to my paper, the Indianapolis Star. And lo and behold, the paper called and they said, we're getting ready to start a new section on Sunday. And we love the fact that you're coaching people. Would you consider sending us some of your previously published materials? And so I said, I sure would, because I had published a paragraph in NASW local. So I hang up the phone and I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, I know what they want. So I'll just create that and I'll send that in to show them I can do the job. And when I came to meet with them, and they had a readership of over 1.5 million people on Sunday.
Wow.
They said, you're hired. We're going to call you Coach Carol. And I said, call me Carol the Coach instead. And I did that for 5 years. That afforded me then segments on TV. And I had 4 different radio shows in my career, 3 of which were call-in. And so that's how I got started. And so when I took my CSAT training, I had lost my last show. I would lose them. And then a year later, I'd get a 2-hour show. And then I'd lose it after a couple of years. And then I'd get, a 1-hour show. So that's just the nature of the biz. And I asked my CSATs, I said, I'm going to start a podcast. And I would like for you all to share with our community what you're doing to help sex addicts. They looked at me scared to death because it was the first podcast on sex addiction in the world.
I was going to say, you've been podcasting way before everybody was podcasting.
Right. I had the very first one. I consider myself the grandmother of podcasting. And now look at the world. I mean, we have so many incredible podcasts just like yours. And so, it would have happened without me, but I love that I was the first. And I will tell you one more thing, and then let's start talking about empathy.
Yeah.
So a year into it, I looked at my demographics. I had never looked at the demographics. It didn't matter whether I had 3 people or 3,000. And the truth is, I always saw every week how many listeners I had from the week before. It just popped up. So I knew I had 34 listeners the first week, 3,000 listeners the second week.
Wow.
30,000 by the end of the 6-month period, and over 100,000 after a year. So I decided, well, let's look more into the demographics. And 54% were women. And of course, my first thing was, oh my gosh, that's a lot of female sex addicts. That only took 3 seconds to process. And I said, no, that's wives trying to figure out what's going on with their husbands.
Yeah.
And that's when I changed the whole show and said, we've got to do a better job of working with couples to help them get through this because she's trying to figure out what's going on. And so is he. So that's how I started working with addicts and partners together.
Yeah. Well, and you said it only took you 3 seconds to process that that's not what's going on. But if that were happening today, it would probably take a lot longer to sift through those demographics because we've seen such an increase in women who are acknowledging their own compulsive or addictive struggles with sex. One of the things that I've been really encouraged is that one of the CSAT therapists here in Birmingham, Alabama, where we are, has decided, he has just gotten his licensure recently and has decided that the bulk of his work is going to be on working with men experiencing betrayal trauma. Because a lot of the people in the CSAT community he's talked with are saying this is just such an underserviced portion. And I think there's a stereotype, maybe it's changing, but you could probably speak to it a lot better than I could, that when you got the betraying partner, that's the man, the betrayed partner, that's the woman. And statistically, I'm sure that's far more often the case, but not all the time, right?
Right. Absolutely. And actually, there is a CSAT who has a wife who's an APSATS, and he has just written the first book on the betrayal trauma model. That'll be coming out in the next couple of months. And I happen to, since I've read the book and wrote the foreword, I happen to know it is an excellent book that talks about the betrayal to the masculinity of a man. That's different than to the woman. The woman is betrayal to her femininity, to her sensuality, her being a mother. I mean, it's just so many things, but it is very different.
Well, something's threatened no matter which gender you are. But just in this second, my brain is spinning and thinking, is it safety primarily that's threatened for a female betrayed spouse? Is it value and identity that's threatened, in the masculinity of the man? Or is that way too simplified?
No, you're spot on. It's like you read the book.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Or maybe lived with somebody.
Right?
Ooh,
No, it's exactly right. And how you have to work with that differently. We've got it down for safety and stabilization. That's an APSATS term. And, we've got it down. I've been lucky enough now that I've been able to teach both in the CSAT world and the APSATS world. I did 7 years of training all professionals with Barbara Steffens. So, talk about being blessed. I just was so blessed to work with her. She's an amazing woman. She started APSATS, and she was the first person that said, let's look at partner betrayal through the lens of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Because before that, everybody was talking about co-addiction and you're just as sick as he is. Yeah. And even if there's stuff to work on, like, give her a minute, right?
Yeah. My premise is that the minute the sex addict comes out of the fog and really has time to grapple with that stinking thinking, that sick thinking that he could do A and B at the same time and get away with it, and it really wouldn't hurt anybody. And when he comes out of that fog, he is traumatized by seeing how traumatized his wife is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that part is the same for men that are betrayed.
Mm-hmm.
The female sex addict has no idea that there's a soft, sensitive heart that will want to be in the fetal position on the floor, but he's too manly to do that. So instead he uses anger as opposed to sadness and vulnerability and hurt. Just a shout out to Stephanie Carnes, because she has created a partner trauma model for her clinicians. And so I love that when we know better, we do better and build it, and it builds itself based on the needs.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and when we know better, we do better is that's a great experience for people who have already committed to the healing work. When we're still in the midst of our chaos, we think that to know better is to do better, but we don't know what we don't know. And when you're in the fog, to use your term, that doesn't work. But when the fog clears and we have options and help and resources that we didn't have before, it's not that knowledge serves no purpose, because it absolutely does, but it isn't enough when we're still in that fog, right? Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Oh, 100%. And that's why I actually created this model called ERCEM. ERCEM is the Early Recovery Couples Empathy Model, because I felt like we as professionals have done a great job of helping partners find safety and stabilization. But we've not done such a great job of that second phase of partner betrayal based on APSATS, which is mourning, grief, and loss. ERCEM has added anger, because, boy, when partners get stronger and they get on their feet, they get in touch with, why did this happen to me? Why did he do that? I'm really mad about that. And what do I do with this anger? Because now I feel safe and I am furious that this is my life. And professionals have to help males or females, but especially females who may not have had as much experience with anger. That's my premise and my bias. Find safe ways to do that and grieve and mourn what she thought she had, what she doesn't have, what she fears she won't ever have, and give them hope of getting over there to post-traumatic growth like the two of you have done.
About a week ago, you had a trigger that just came and hit you out of nowhere. I mean, we're coming up, Carol, on 16 years since everything was revealed and I began recovery. And I've been sober the entire time. And that doesn't matter. I mean, of course it matters, but it doesn't have a controlling influence on whether or not Stacy still becomes triggered.
Yeah, there's these three kind of triggers for our listening audience, and they are external. That's D-Day, that's going to weddings, that's seeing a yellow house that triggers you because you saw those texts in your yellow kitchen. I mean, there are things that you've been able to associate that you know are going to be triggering. Just even your anniversary can be a trigger. But then there are internal triggers that are unconscious that your body has kept score of. You have no understanding of. And it might have been a dream you had that you don't remember that triggered you. And then you have that lingering feeling of not feeling safe.
Right.
And what is going on with you? And now I believe, and I'm sure you've seen it, that triggers get better and better and better. You're not defined by triggers, but they are disorienting when they come up.
It used to be when that would happen, that would throw me into shame or maybe disappointment, but just it turned into a really connecting conversation. And, you kind of resisted at first, like going into that conversation because you were flooded, but then it calmed down really quickly compared to how it used to would have gone.
That's what I would say. Like sometimes I feel like the emotion or the overwhelmed feeling in the moment of a trigger, it almost reminds me of the early days because it's so like I have to think I can't breathe or this is too much or can we just be okay with where we are? But the thing that just like he said, it was pretty quickly, I was able to talk through it. We talked through it. And of course, the empathy piece, huge. I'm so excited to talk about that because he's early on. I think there was does my work not count for something? I'm like sober and yes, but don't say that to me,
It's hard not to ask that question, but it's important to realize that that's not going to have a good effect.
No. So there's the triggers do get less. And even if it feels pretty intense, coming off the ledge is quicker.
Addicts need to hear those kind of things and need to learn their own feelings so they could help the partner with hers and find out what needs were there. And when they saw a trigger, sit with her. Now, partners know themselves. And if that's the last thing she wants, that's fine too. I always say once discovery and disclosure occurs, the partner's in the driver's seat. Early recovery couples empathy work is when the addict is willing to do a disclosure. That's the last thing he wants to do is hurt his wife more and give all the details. But she's got to know the truth. To know how to deal with it. And then that restitution letter is such a gift of empathy. When he can say, I heard you say, this is how you felt. And I can't imagine what it's like, but it makes sense to me. And he goes through that letter writing process. That's an amazing gift of empathy. And then just reflective listening. Addicts want to explain themselves, but really what's more important is that the partner feels heard. And it won't have to go like that for 3 to 5 years, which is about the same amount of time for a partner to heal as it is for the addict. The gift of reflective listening and ABR and mirroring and focused listening, those are all empathy tools that helps her to feel safe. And when she feels safe, you feel safe. And that coupled with not going into shame, we do a lot of shame resiliency skills for addicts because that's naturally where they go.
Sure.
And when they go into shame, what happens? It makes it all about him.
Yes.
And that's not fair to her.
Right.
So, it's a whole psychoeducation. And I really believe in interspersing some post-traumatic growth in each and every stage. There's 3 stages of partner betrayal. There's 3 stages for ERCEM. And empathy is such a big part of that. Empathy, it's when you can really take the perspective of somebody else and recognize where it is in the body and link it to a feeling. You're doing that for the person that's being triggered. And then you're doing it non-judgmentally.
We'll be right back.
How have things gotten so out of control? How did something that didn't seem like such a big deal at first completely take over? Porn and sex addiction are destroying your life and killing your relationships. You know you can't keep going on like this, keeping secrets and telling lies. Something has to change. But how? Most men who struggle with unwanted or addictive sexual behavior have tried to fix it on their own. But sex addiction is powerful and complicated. Recovery is possible, but it isn't easy. It requires us to focus on more than just behavior. It requires us to look at our whole lives and the parts of our stories that contribute to addiction. If you're ready to find freedom, maybe it's time for you to get to the roots. The Roots Retreat is a 4-day therapeutic and spiritual intensive. You'll work with therapists and coaches who specialize in sex addiction and recovery. You'll learn how to take healthy ownership of your behavior You'll discover how your life experiences set the stage for addiction to develop. You'll see how God factors into your struggle, and you'll learn effective tools for ongoing recovery after the retreat. If you're ready to stop trying what doesn't work, if you're ready to experience real hope, healing, and change, let's get to the roots.
Visit awakenrecovery.com/roots retreat or click the Roots Retreat link in show notes.
For instance, where did you feel that trigger in your body that day, Stacy?
It's a good question. Usually everything is in my gut, but I think that kind of trigger is my chest because I can't breathe. It's overwhelming me. Mm-hmm.
And so when you feel that feeling, what feeling does it link to? And I do 5 because I think that keeping it simple for partners and addicts is the best thing. Did you feel angry? Did you feel sad? Did you feel lonely? Or did you feel fear? We know you didn't feel happy.
That's a given, yes. I think there's some anger in there. And maybe along with that, fear that it's never going to change.
So if you were my client, I would say, okay, pick the primary feeling.
Primary one. Probably anger.
Okay, you said probably. Give it a statement. Carol, I felt angry because.
Okay. I felt angry because I'm dealing with this still, and you're not.
Beautiful.
Yep.
Beautiful.
You said that.
That I did say that. That is, yeah, that's it.
And so that last criteria for empathy, because remember, it's just perspective taking.
Mm-hmm.
It's realizing where's the emotionality. It's linking it to a feeling. That last part is when you see that in your partners or even in your addicts, depending on what the issue is, do it non-judgmentally. I mean, it's important for Greg to go, oh no, she's never going to get over these darn triggers. And I think she's kind of crazy. No, we know you wouldn't say that, Greg.
Didn't even think it this time.
This time. But, that judgment comes across. You heard a little bit of judgment in Stacy when she said, why am I dealing with this and you aren't?
Well, the statement that is just the reality is you're the one who did this and you just feel free as a bird. Like these thoughts never pop into your head and that just doesn't seem fair.
And alongside of that, I don't want him thinking about what he did before, but that's the tension. I don't want you thinking about that. And yet, I'm the one thinking about it. That stuff's clogging up my head.
Boy, that's such a good point. It's like you're healthy enough to know, I want him to be proud of his recovery and I want him to be forward thinking and I want him to move forward. I want us to move forward. And the truth is, this is so painful. And he did this to me. And now what do I do with it with my partner, with Greg?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, Greg, what did you do to show Stacy empathy?
I'm trying to remember exactly what I said, but one thing I remember saying is all of that makes total sense. I mean, AVR showed up. I wasn't thinking of it in those terms, and we can talk in a minute about what AVR stands for. There is a tendency in those moments for you to just want to put your head down and just like put it to the side and let's just go ahead and move forward. I said, that's not the most important thing right now. Us talking about this is more important than that.
Yeah.
So
I'm really hanging in there and I wouldn't say pushing me, but encouraging, like, let's talk about this. Let's not push past it. And that frustrates me because I'm like, I'm so tired of this. I don't want to talk about it, but I know I need to. And so, I think. Well,
and if talking about it needs to be later, like let's just push pause and we'll even talk about this later if we need to.
But you not having any, and I know it's a big ask, but like there is not any frustration in you
this time.
There have been times you're frustrated, but when there's that frustration, it's like, it shuts me down. The empathy and the understanding, it's so big.
Well, it sounds like frustration to you, Stacy, felt like he was being judgmental.
Yeah.
Like, oh, great. How long is this going to happen?
Exactly.
And that's that really important part of empathy. So, Greg, at least this time, he keeps qualifying, but you did a great job leaning in. And you, of course, follow her directive. I mean, if you had been flooded so badly you couldn't. That's important to hear.
Yes.
But here's what I believe, and this is what I want our couples to believe. In healthy relationships, conflict breeds intimacy. And you two are at a place where you are healthy, despite the painful reminders of the past.
Yeah.
You worked hard at this, and our couples can do that. And they can do it. And, Patrick Carnes taught me, out of huge suffering comes incredible transformation and then post-traumatic growth, giving back on some level, whether it's to your spouse, whether it's to your grandkids, whether it's to the community or the world of partners and the world of sex addicts. And you both have decided to do that, right? It's part of the healing journey.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been huge. I think I've hit the jackpot with my friend group. Those people that have come into my life have specifically come because of the betrayal trauma. So that's where we meet, which is really hard. And we always joke about, we wish we'd met at a book club. But there's no pretense that everything's going well and there's no mask. And so out of that, I've just gotten to be so close with these ladies. And I am not grateful for the cheating, but I'm grateful for where we are coming out of that.
And that's post-traumatic growth. And that, as important as empathy is, it's also important to know, especially for partners, but this applies to both, that it is a choice what you do with your life. And when you decide, I'm not going to be defined by partner betrayal, I'm going to be defined by something else. And maybe that's a betrayal trauma coach, or maybe that's somebody who does missions in other countries and thinks about other things besides their pain.
Right.
We've got to get partners, start finding their purpose and their passion and having fun again. And one of the hardest exercises that I give in ERCEM is I say, no recovery talk for a whole week. And you have to have at least 2 encounters where you go out and figure out what you're going to talk about that doesn't have to do with recovery.
I don't think about it every time I talk to people, which has amazed me over the years. Like when they're sharing their story, I'm literally not taken to the things, in the beginning when I was hearing things from Greg. To me, that is incredible. I mean, I'm sure
it'll hit you later.
It'll hit me later sometimes, but like in the moment, I can sit with that person and I just am amazed that can happen. So yeah.
Okay,
there is
Carol,
hope.
I want to ask you about Help Her Heal and Help Them Heal. When I heard about Help Her Heal, I got a copy of that and I said, this is important. And I started passing it along to a lot of the therapist friends that I have. And we've actually taken some couples through it in a little small group. And the thing that struck me is the empathy that you are describing and painting a picture of. And I'm just going to say for men who are in the betrayer role, that the early work of recovery that they've got to do, it's so critical because I've come to believe really strongly that, like something that you said earlier, as hard as it is for the wife to understand, he didn't do this with the intention of hurting her. In a lot of cases. Now, there are some times when you've got, diagnosable disorders where some of that's going on.
But in most cases, he did not.
In most cases, he didn't. And what he was doing was the evolution of a strategy for self-care that he adopted way before he met you. And
you're exactly right.
And so when I was acting out, I was not thinking as my adult self. I was in child consciousness. And so I didn't have the capacity for empathy when I'm in that place. And so you talk about how important early sobriety is so that we can put on our Teflon, as you say in the workbook, and be able to have the capacity to accept the hurt and the anger without it totally derailing us. So talk to me a little bit about the path that led you to eventually writing this workbook with Alan Katz, and then a few years later, writing Help Them Heal for couples to go through together.
Well, I started working primarily with addicts, and they followed my 10 recovery tools, and they got better. They got better. They found support. They realized they weren't the only one. The darkness kind of lifted. And I'd say, well, everything seems to be going well. And they'd go, well, not at home. no, my wife's in the fetal position on the floor, or I woke up in the middle of the night and she was beating me, and there's never been an angry bone in her. I don't know what to do here. And so that's when I developed a bit of a curriculum for them and would give them worksheets and think about, what are you willing to do for her? And, how have you wounded her? And how can you talk to her differently? And just some real simple empathy strategies. And they came back and they said, this is magic. This is making a real difference in my relationship. And so I was on the board of APSATs and said to my colleagues on the board, there are no empathy books for sex addicts. And Alan Katz wrote that intimacy chapter, and Alan and I were going to write the book together. He gave me intimacy, and I go, that's perfect. I've already written the rest of the book. But I'm putting your chapter in.
That's awesome.
But I always say he was the catalyst for me, because once I had somebody on board, he's just so skilled. He's written many, many books himself. Once I had somebody on board, it got me to do it. And I finished it in 9 months. What I did was I saw a big gaping hole and said, we need to be the change we want to see. And so that's when I put it together. I was a little embarrassed. It had 2 flaws, I thought. One was it's so simplistic. And I felt much better when neuroscientists and doctors would come in and go, I should have had this book 10 years ago. And I went, oh, wow. So somebody who has way more intelligence than I do got a lot from the book. And then men all over the world are saying that this has really helped them. And then what I noticed, I have an online course for Help Her Heal. And then women were taking the course with the men. And I at least liked that, because they could hear me explaining the concepts. They didn't have to try to put it together by themselves. And then my next book was Unleashing Your Power, moving you through sexual betrayal for the partner. And I got a course for them on post-traumatic growth too. But what my second issue was, it stopped midstream. I mean, I taught the empathy skills and I taught what I thought was important when you're in with your therapist, but I didn't teach women who now are in somewhat of a power position how to begin to heal themselves and also give back to the addict who's trying so hard.
Yeah.
And so that's what Help Them Heal is all about. It takes them again from the beginning, and then it says partners. At some point, you got to make a choice to make some shifts in your relationship and in what you think about yourself, and move forward with or without them. Yeah. And I think that book is so powerful because it does teach them to work together through all 3 stages. And when you do that and get over to post-traumatic growth, which it's not linear, by the time you're in post-traumatic growth, you're rocking it. You have created a whole new life for yourself. And unfortunately, that's what I think they need to do, is create a whole new marriage.
Yeah. We say our first one is dead. It's gone. We have a second marriage
got that
without
picture
a divorce.
from some stuff we heard from Esther Perel.
Yeah,
so it was really helpful.
Yeah, what she says is, because I show it in every ERCEM training, people will marry 2 or 3 times. And many times it's to each other. Your marriage with infidelity is dead. Do you want to create a whole new marriage? That's my Esther Perel.
Spot on.
Well done.
Spot on.
Yes.
And she did, and that is called the Scarlet Letter of Shame. So if you can listen to that entire thing, I only show a clip of it, and it's funny. And she says, "Now I am not pro infidelity."
Yeah.
Well,
That's so good.
To the 2 flaws that you perceived that you had, starting with the second one that you felt like it stopped in midstream, now you have the ability to say, that was the plan all along. But it's cool now because you do have that next step, and it allows the simplicity of the message of Help Her Heal to not cloud things up too much, because I think its simplicity is one of its greatest assets for the person for whom the fog is beginning to lift, and they don't need to have something that's complicated. I mean, I say all the time, recovery is so hard that if it was hard and complicated, nobody would stay in it. These things are simple in that they're uncomplicated, which is good because it's not easy to do. But just give us an example, because I want people to get in to read the workbook and do the work themselves instead of us just telling them about it. But you've mentioned AVR a couple of times. I think that could give our listeners a really good idea of one of the examples that's a simple one that can help men begin to model empathy as they are moving along the path towards actually developing legitimate, organic empathy for their partner.
Well, if you remember, I said it's perspective taking. So the first thing that an addict in recovery can do is he can look at his wife and say, I want to acknowledge your challenge and struggle, that our D-Day is coming up. We've got 4 years into recovery and it still hurts. I want to validate that you must be feeling sad because you didn't think it would still hurt. But I want to reassure you that we're still together. We're working on things. And every day I thank my lucky stars that you've remained with me. It's acknowledging the issue. It's validating the primary feeling. And it's reassuring, whether that's, I want to reassure you, I'll talk to my sponsor about that tonight. I'll talk to the pastor. I want to reassure you, this is exactly what I'm talking about in our groups. Whatever the reassurance is, it should be simple. Let me just tell you, if you're going to try it, don't go on and on and on about all the things you're doing.
Yes.
Well, isn't it also important?
Preach.
Isn't it also important for the recovering person to know it isn't wise for the reassurance to take the form of, I promise I'll never look at porn again. I promise I'll never betray you in this way again. It's different to have a commitment to do the work so that doesn't happen. It's another thing to make a specific promise. And haven't you found that there are a lot of partners who want that promise, even though oftentimes it's just words? And why would it be important to know that that's not really a very healthy form of reassurance?
Well, the truth of the matter is, Greg, you are in the minority. Most men slip at least a couple of times a year until their brain totally redevelops that neurocircuitry. And I'm not giving men or women who are sex addicts a get out of jail card, but this is the hardest addiction to learn how to manage. And so if an addict in recovery makes a false promise, then she gets hurt again and start protecting herself and not even being open to his empathy. Because we know even if an addict slips, he still has good intentions. That means he needs to strengthen his recovery program. He just does. And that may mean 90 meetings in 90 days, as tough as that sounds. Or that may mean you go to an intensive, or you get your butt into residential treatment. Or, there are other things you can do. Just so many places we can send people to get the extra help that they need, more than one person or one couple, whatever.
So good.
I know that we're almost out of time. What I'm hearing from what you said is recovery at the beginning is different from recovery down the line. And something that you say on the website when you're talking about, the early processes, the hard work for the betraying spouse is stepping up and doing 80% of the work to help her heal. And one of the things that is a protest that we hear is from the betraying partners, well, when has she got to step up and do her part? And so I think the question is, like, I don't believe that you're saying that the partner who is betrayed will always be expected to do 80% of the work, right?
That's why I wrote Help Them Heal. When they are at the end of safety and stabilization and they're moving into all that grief work with anger, they're actually dabbling with post-traumatic growth, and they need to start giving the sex addict empathy. They need to start receiving with an open heart so that the power differential starts to meet again in the middle. Believe it or not, that's at the end of phase 1. That was what I saw. That was what was wrong with Help Her Heal, is that I didn't say more coming on how to involve the partner in her own healing and in also giving back to you for being with her while you're in recovery, because that has to be acknowledged too.
Yeah, that's a big one, because a lot of my friends that, we're in recovery together, I don't have to do that, and they're just very resistant to acknowledging anything.
Well, and they don't
good
have
that they're
to,
doing. They
but
don't have to.
what do you want for yourself in this relationship
at some point,
if you choose to stay in it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Stacey and I have a story about when I first, about 10 months into recovery, for the first time spoke up for myself. And just what rose up in her. There's not time to tell you about it, but it's just exactly what you're talking about now. But what you said earlier about like in the early phases to not focus on the trauma that they're going through, it's even stymieing their ability to show up with empathy even when they would want to. And when people are really looking to get healed and healthy, I mean, there's going to be maybe reluctant at first, but eventually there's going to be a willingness to continue doing the harder work.
Well, that's what we as therapists and coaches have to educate. Last but not least, 20 years ago, it was sex addicts, you do your work in your own program. You get over there and do your work because you're just as sick as he is. And maybe you can come back together in a couple years. And I really believe from the bottom of my heart, and what I've seen to be true over and over and over again, is the addict has to work on his own recovery and get some feedback from the partner. And then they have to work on relational recovery together. And it has to be simultaneous. And it ends up being a win-win for both if it's done properly. I know there will be people that will build on ERCEM and make it better and better and better. So I'm always asking the people I train, give me your feedback, give me your exercises. Let's make this as robust as possible. These couples deserve it. And I just want to thank you so much for your podcast.
Oh, thank you for being on.
talking to us.
Carol, there are people who are benefiting from what you've contributed to this area of work that don't even know who you are. And one of the reasons we wanted to have you on is so that they would know. Your influence over the past at least 25 years has been on us and on so many people. And I just wanted to let you know how grateful we are for you. So thank you. And thanks for being on today.
Thank you.
We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, feedback, topics you'd like to hear us talk about on the show, click the Send Us a Message link in the show notes of any episode.